First of all, I was very involved and still am with Ken Wilber's wonderful work and his integral paradigm. I feel that my experience through the years is that he has identified the primordial opposing pairs. Secondly, Susanne Cook-Greuter was my teacher, and she introduced me to the ego development model. The third area is my spiritual path. And at some point, the sun came up over the mountains and something dropped into me at that point. And it was the basics of the ego development model, integrating with Ken's model, integrating with spirituality. I just sketched this out. It was gone in a moment. And then when I had the sketch, it gave me something to work on and to work with.
Terri O'Fallon is a developmental psychologist who created the groundbreaking stages model of human consciousness evolution. In this episode, she explains how consciousness develops through distinct stages, from concrete childhood thinking to the highest levels of spiritual awareness, and why understanding these stages matters for your personal development.
We as babies are socially constructed. We as parents socially construct them by the rules we put on them, by how often we hold our babies and cuddle our babies, by the words that we say to them, by how we react to their emotions. All of that is us showing our boundaries to our children, and they interject those.
What makes the stages model so valuable is how it precisely maps out what each stage looks like and the transformations between them.
Every time you move from one stage to another, you're going to have a feeling that is similar to that. Things are falling apart. What's wrong? I'm not the person I used to be, but I don't know who I am yet. There's a big confusion that comes up at every single transformation that we go through. Some transformations are more difficult than others.
Throughout our conversation, Terri explains the specific mechanics of how we transform from one stage to the next, including the confusion and challenges that we may encounter during these transitions.
It's one of the most beautiful gifts you can give somebody that's in a transformation, to say, guess what? You're changing. This is normal. And you're going through something that will help you have bigger insights and see things in even a better way than you do now. Enjoy it. A transformation can actually be enjoyable.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Hey, Terri, it's wonderful to see you.
Good to see you too, Scott.
Well, I'm so excited to talk about my favorite topic, which is consciousness and the evolution of consciousness and your wonderful stages model. And I'd love maybe just to give the audience a little bit of background on what the stages model is as a starting point.
Well, I would say the background was there's several areas that the stages model covers, and my background really relates to those very areas and how they integrate. First of all, I was very involved and still am with Ken Wilber's wonderful work and his integral paradigm. I feel that my experience through the years is that he has identified the primordial opposing pairs. I think you can't get much earlier than individual, collective, interior, exterior. And then we also use the static and the dynamic, which are the poles that are his diagonals. Secondly, Susanne Cook-Greuter was my teacher, and she introduced me to the ego development model. And that was a profound understanding for me, and I am eternally grateful for the things that I've learned from her. And the third area is my spiritual path. Um, I was sitting in a retreat with Father Thomas Keating um, many years ago, and we would get up for their um, early morning retreats and be there by 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was very dark, and yet we would see, the audience was off on the side, but when the monks came in, they were all wearing white, and they would float down the stairs and then sit in a circle, and it was just there was something about that that just put you in a state. And every morning that would happen. And one morning I was really very um, moved and in a state when I left. And I went up to my cabin, and on the way to the cabin, there was this little chapel. And so I went into the chapel, and there were no chairs in there, and there was this big window like this. And suddenly, uh, I just sat down just to kind of sit and be with it. And of course, I had my little pad and pencil with me because I was taking notes on what the monks were doing. And at some point, the sun came up over the mountains, and something dropped into me at that point. And it was the basics of the ego development model, integrating with Ken's model, integrating with spirituality. This was not my idea, and there are many, many people that have these experiences. I don't claim to be, you know, uh, uh, unique in this area, but just because I happened to have it was such a fleeting moment, and because I happened to have my pad and pencil with me, I just sketched this out. It was gone in a moment, and then when I had the sketch, it gave me something to work on and to work with. So this is why I say that I am not an owner of the stages model. It somehow was given to me, like other things are given to many people in this world today. I feel that I've been a guardian of it. Maybe, uh, um, I mean, we can always get better at guardianship, that's for sure. But um, that was over 15 years ago, and since then, it's this model has kind of come together with research. Um, I know that my own distinctions have altered some of these areas, and it just has continued to evolve thanks to the support and the help of so many people. I'm not really the one that has done all the contributions here. The students that we've had through the years have contributed so much, and so of course is my brother Ken, Suzanne, uh, and countless others. So that's kind of the history of the stages model. And to this day, it continues to evolve, and new things keep coming up all the time. And we never think, my sense is it will never be done. There's not a finish here.
Wow. I had no idea that there was, yeah, I guess a moment of insight or kind of a through you consciousness that contributed to the formation of the model. I love that. That's so cool. And I think for people that have maybe less familiarity with you know, a model of consciousness, like what is the utility of something like the stages model for a person who is starting to investigate their spiritual path or just their personal development?
Well, to me, this stages model is incredibly practical, feet on the grounds. And it actually is a structure that you can put your growth and development within, and it has certain characteristics and forms. Uh, um, I would say boundaries that we can see at each developmental level, and it helps us know when we're in the transformation or not. There are actually 4 tiers in this model, and each tier has 4 developmental stages. So the first tier is a concrete tier, and that's, of course, our babyhood, our childhood, and all of that. And there's a subtle tier, and there is, and that is, when we're Most people are at adult levels, and there's 4 more stages there. Then we have the meta-aware tier, which actually gets into a requirement of having states. You can't really get into those stages unless you're in a state, unless you have certain capacity to take, the view of larger states. And then there is a unified tier that we don't really have any research on, but we get glimpses from time to time about what that tier really holds. So we keep on working with it. And the thing about this is that in the concrete tier, we're forming boundaries. Babies don't have any boundaries. So it's really practical for parents to know what a boundary is. And, like a baby doesn't know if they roll over in their bed, they're going to fall on the floor because they don't have depth perception yet. It's really practical to understand when a baby gets depth perception because that's their first boundary, up and down. And of course, later on, rules are a boundary. It's rules according to their physical behavior. You don't hit people and you don't run out in the street and certain boundaries. So rules become boundaries. And all through our life, we build different kinds of boundaries. These boundaries help us categorize things. And so at the concrete tier, we get concrete boundaries. In the subtle tier, we get subtle boundaries. We identify different kinds of boundaries around our intellect and our behavior and our emotions and our social proclivities. And then in the meta-aware tier, we start taking the boundaries off. And so it seems to be that we end up getting an understanding of all those things that we learned in the concrete and subtle tier. So that's kind of an overview of the bigger pieces of what happens in the stages model. And it's so practical because if you understand what those boundaries are as a parent, you can actually facilitate your children's emotional, their social, their physical, their intellectual, and their sensory capacities. If you just know what they are, and that the child will probably will learn them in one way or another, but there are healthy ways to learn it and unhealthy ways to learn it. And then in the subtle tier, you're the parent and you have boundaries. And how are you working with your children based on your own boundaries? And some of your boundaries may not have been so good when you were little, and you may have boundaries that may impede your own child's development if you don't know the limitations or the unhealth of the boundaries, which is the shadow work that Kim does so much. And so with that, and then as time goes on, of course, you start understanding boundaries themselves a little bit more. But a lot of people don't understand, just what that word boundaries mean, because it's everywhere,
Well, it is. I mean, it is such a fascinating thing to start to, I guess you would call it in the meta-aware stage. You realize that your entire orientation is essentially directed by these conceptual boundaries, which were largely inherited, right? And they
introject.
Massively limit human potential. They completely direct your life. And you didn't choose any of it. It was, I always think of like a mountaintop that just accumulates snow by being there. It's kind of what happens with our consciousness. And, that unlayering process, unlearning, it's so rich because it's so profound, right? You start to just make sense of why your experience is the way it is and become more of an author of your experience. And that's very exciting.
Yes, we call that the social construction of reality. We as babies are socially constructed. We as parents socially construct them by the rules we put on them, by how often we hold our babies and cuddle our babies, by the words that we say to them, by how we react to their emotions, the kicking and screaming in the grocery store, as opposed to, I love you, mommy. You know, all of that is us showing our boundaries to our children, and they interject those. And of course, we also have interjected when we were growing up. So we tend to pass these things down from generation to generation unless we recognize what those are. And um, it is a lot of people really want to jump right away to the meta tier because it's stages that are a little later than some of the others. On the other hand, if they don't understand their own childhood and how they were socially constructed, how they grow up, they have these boundaries, and then they put those boundaries on their own children, and they socially construct their children. The country we live in is a social construction. The language we speak is a social construction. So there's so many things that babies learn as a result of the contexts that they live in, the family context, the educational context, the language context, where they grew up.
Yeah, I mean, as a new parent, to me, it's very top of mind for me to not simply project my conditioning onto my child like was done to me. And inevitably that will happen to varying degrees. But if I can at least start to, I guess, imbue more healthy concepts and ways of being to set my daughter up for success, like that's a huge win for me. And one of the reasons I am so motivated to work on my consciousness. One question, I have a lot of questions for you, but maybe I think there's a lot of people that maybe have experienced Ken Wilber's work or spiral dynamics or some of these other things, Susanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory, and just curious to understand like I guess how you built upon that specifically. How is it specifically different than some of these other models that are out there?
For one thing, we have defined every perspective in our model has a specific definition, and it's not a stereotype definition. It is a structural definition. So, for instance, we have the baby. First, baby comes up at, we call it the 1.0 stage. I mean, some people use colors, some people use fractions. They have all these different ways that they try to describe these. But the definition, the form that the structural form that an early first person perspective has at 1.0 is the child is in a concrete stage. They're in an individual stage, but they're also in a receptive or a passive. That means they take everything in. And of course, that gives us the form around the different areas that they have to express themselves in that stage. Then, in the more mature 1.5 stage, the first person perspective, they have a concrete, it's individual, but this time it's active. And we all know the terrible twos, how active they are. They're very different from the 1.0.
I'm living it.
Yes, it's fantastic. The thing is that in those definitions, those structural definitions that we don't see very often, in those structural one of the things that we can see is that there's a wide variety of experiences and um, uh, characteristics and essences that each person can have that may fit the stereotypes that we see in research and in a lot of areas. And yet there are also many unique things to each child or each human being. It's we each have our own fingerprint, cognitive, social, emotional, behavioral fingerprint, I would say, that is uniquely ours, that fit within the definitions, the structural definitions, but may not fit the stereotypes. So the stereotypes are the grooves that most people have, and they'll be alike other people. Like when we say the terrible twos, everybody conjures up what that means. But one child's terrible twos may be a very different for them than another one, their behavior. And a lot of it depends upon what they're interjecting from their contexts. The interesting thing for me is that um, interjects are often thought of as shadow material that is maybe not so good. But children interject the best things about their parents too. They really don't have, all they have is the experience that they receive in that stage. So you don't want to say, "Oh, I don't want to affect my child at all because it means that they're getting things from me that isn't their own." They're going to get it somewhere because they're in a receptive mode and they're just going to receive everything that's around them. You have beautiful characteristics, loving characteristics that your daughter can benefit from. And so you want her to have that. So you just look at, okay, what might she interject from me? And what do I have that I have learned in my life that will be beneficial to her in her life? And what can I avoid that have been a struggle for me in my life? And I'm not going to expose her to that. You want to help shape your daughter. Everybody is shaped. We're all socially constructed. The thing is, how do you do the shaping? That's the big lesson of the concrete tear.
I guess the way that what comes up for me is just it's wonderful if you can have a real kind of consciousness, a conscious decision around those things, right? Versus just moving through with reactivity and then, someone's just getting what they're getting. One thing I've heard you talk about that I wanted to touch on was this balloon metaphor as we think about development, as we think about our development. And maybe as a starting point, you could describe just this metaphor and how you think about it.
Well, that goes into the development of time. And of course, I think about the balloon because of the experience I've had with time in my own life. And one of the things about the stages model is it has point O stages and point 0.5 stages. The point O stages are all the earlier development, the early part of a perspective. The point 0.5 are the mature parts of a perspective. But the point O stages are a horizontal stage. It doesn't work so well with the vertical. We want our children to grow horizontally in richness as well as vertically. We don't want to start teaching them when they're 6 months old how to read. We want to have them have the richness of the experiences that they have uh, in their emotional, social, sensory, physical, uh, all of those different areas of capacities, the richness of the most positive things we can give them. Um, and so, so those point O stages uh, are more horizontal. If you have a tall vertical balloon that's skinny, it's going to fall over. If you have a balloon that is tall, is laying on its side like this, it doesn't really get the height that it needs. So the metaphor of the balloon is really what we want to do is blow up a balanced balloon at every developmental level. And a baby is perfectly formed. You would not ever say that a baby is less important than somebody that is at a later developmental level. That's just looking at the vertical. You wouldn't want to say that, that a baby is better because they're in such a wide learning horizontal space. What we want to see is a balanced balloon that just grows up in all of those areas all the way through our lives. This means we're probably going to run into some things. For instance, as a parent, you might, um, you know, bully your staff once in a while. You're a human being. Your child might cry. Is this going to make it bad for your baby? Well, you certainly don't want to do any of that on purpose, but, being human. But a baby gradually learns resilience too. You want your child to be resilient. You don't want them to never have anything that they have to bump up against or that they're scared of doing. So those flaws that we might see in ourselves, as long as they're not uh, traumatic and damaging to our children, actually help them learn. Even saying no to a child, they may cry and they may be upset, but that no is a boundary that is healthy for them. They don't know that. They just know they're mad because they don't get what they want. It teaches them to be resilient. And so we want resiliency in our children. That grows up with us through the years. And it's very helpful when we're trying to do spiritual practice. It's the beginning of learning to concentrate.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness: The Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. What's coming up for me is I think a lot of people, once they get on their spiritual or consciousness journey, they just want to go straight up, right? They're like, all right, take me to the top, enlightenment, here we go. And I think that what you're saying is actually no, like there's these different stages of experience and you want to kind of enjoy and learn to occupy each stage as you elevate, as you expand your consciousness.
Yes, but you might imagine, what stage some of our great spiritual leaders were 5,000 years ago. They may not have been at 6.0. They may have been at 2.5, a conformist stage, or 3.0, a nonconformist stage. They may have been in a stage like that, but there wasn't anything beyond that at the time. So what we've been learning through time is that you can have these very late states at pretty early developmental levels. I once helped do a research project. These folks asked me to score 80 some of the most advanced spiritual meditators that they knew, and I scored 80 of them. And the expectations were that they would be, like 6.0 or later. Most of them were at 2.5 conformist stage, 3.0 expert stage, 3.5, a few of those, but they were much earlier. You can be at a very advanced state, but you will only see the developmental level perspectives that you've arrived at in your growth and development. So you want your child to start learning spirituality. They come up with these magical things. There's nothing wrong with them having mythic experiences with stories of Jesus or God or Allah or whatever they are. This helps them develop some formative processes. There's nothing wrong with saying prayers before you go to bed. That's actually probably healthy because we're working at a 1.5, a conformist level later on. Once they start getting those habits spread out and grow. So it gives them a base to work from. And every spiritual path I know of has preliminary stages that people work with. For instance, almost every spiritual path has bowing, or genuflecting or prostrations. Now that will help at one point. If you have 100,000 prostrations, bows, or genuflects, that would kind of bring your little egocentric mind in order, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the big unlocks with this these unified models of consciousness for me has been there's nothing that's right or wrong. There's just certain things that tend to be more apt for certain experiences. And it's a very empowering understanding to move out of that polarity and see the beauty in certain things like a prostration where I could see someone instead of I could see, I know there's spiritual people who be like, I would never do that. I don't want to bow to anything. Like that's like a threat to my sovereignty. And, perhaps, that viewpoint is appropriate at a certain point, but I could see, yeah, like maybe for somebody super early in their development, this idea that there's something bigger out there that is supporting them could be really useful.
Those are preliminary practices in a lot of our spiritual paths. Um, these days, though, I mean, 5, 8, 10,000 years ago, 1.5 was an adult. They weren't at 2 years old, And so 100,000 prostrations was probably pretty good for them. We would never ask a 1.5 child to do 100,000 prostrations or genuflect. We have other things that we can do with them now. So this is how these practices grow up over time. And we can have some very egocentric people at the 3.5 developmental level who may have had parenting or social construction of reality that makes them somewhat narcissistic. And 1.5, which is the little narcissistic, egocentric, second year through fourth year or something like that, perfectly normal. But they get some boundaries and some rules and no's, and then that helps them grow up. But the upshift of that is in the next tier. You get another chance at 3.5, and that's the achiever stage. The 1.5 stage is a very much a little child achiever things. They want to do things, The upshift at the next tier is an adult that is at the achiever stage where they set goals and they want to get things done and they want to achieve some things in their life. And if they haven't had a good background with curbing their egocentricity, a good thing for them to do is preliminary practices with genuflecting, bowing, and prostrations. But you would never give that to a child. You see how this goes. And this is the thing about time. It cycles. It cycles up through each of the tiers.
You made this distinction that I think is really important of state and stage because I was just in a conversation with a group of people about a very famous meditation teacher who is honestly an asshole in a lot of conversations. And I guess there was this like, well, how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of someone who's quote unquote like living in these non-dual things and yet just is not nice and kind to people and can be very reactive. And I think this model and distinction that you offered can kind of shed a light on what's happening in those type of situations.
Yes. And of course, with even the most distinctive spiritual teacher can have shadow elements. How were they socially constructed? And what did they interject? And have they done their shadow work so that they can dispel that and grow up through that? And even out those shadow elements, make some corrections along the way. And some people don't do that and they don't see that they have that shadow. They don't see that they're unkind. Uh, and of course, sometimes you can have non-dual experiences. Like there's several kinds of, I mean, in spiritual paths, people understand that non-duality really works with the absolute and the relative. And the relative is everything in our ordinary world, in the world that we live from day to day. And we want those two things to come together, this timeless, boundless field. But there's also a horizontal oneness. And that's when, for instance, a relative to a relative, like let's take projection, which usually is seen. It happens all the way along the way, but it's usually seen at the 4.5 strategist level of development. It's a very late stage. I think that it's Teal in Wilber's model. Uh, but in that one, uh, you look at somebody and say, "Oh, that person is so judgmental." Then all of a sudden you realize I'm judgmental too. So what you see in the other person is in you. And in that way, you are one with them. And there may be a whole lot of those things that you have. That person is so kind. Oh, well, I guess I have some kindness in myself too. That person is so joyful. Oh, I see that I have that in me too. There's that kind of relative oneness that some people see, and that isn't the primordial pair of the absolute spiritual, timeless, boundless, changeless, loving field that we are, and all of the relative which it saturates.
I appreciate that distinction because I think I think some things like oneness can be interpreted differently, and can mean different things. And so, yeah, that's wonderful. And I think another thing that I wanted to touch upon with you is that as someone goes on this journey and they're, moving from these different stages, although if you're not familiar with the model, you might not know that, you may just feel like my life's falling apart. Like
Yeah.
everything is not going well and I don't feel good and things are hard. And I want you to just talk about like how we can relate to that once we're kind of aware that this is actually kind of expected.
Well, every time you move from one stage to another, you're going to have a feeling that is similar to that. Things are falling apart. What's wrong? I'm not the person I used to be, but I don't know who I am yet. There's a big confusion that comes up at every single transformation that we go through. Some transformations are more difficult than others. For instance, if you go from let's say an early third person perspective, the 3.0 stage, it's a horizontal stage, into a 3.5 stage, which is an active stage, that's just a one parameter change. So you are, both of those stages are subtle, both of those stages are individual, but one is receptive and the other one is active. So you only have one change you have to make. Then there's two parameter changes. Let's say you're going from a third person perspective to a fourth person perspective. Okay, so you have a third person perspective is a subtle, they're focused individually. These are the structural aspects. And and then, you're in an active experience. Well, you move to 4.0, you're still subtle, but you aren't in an individual frame anymore. You're in a collective one. And you're not in an active frame. You're in one of these receptive frames again, but it's collective receptive. So you've got a two parameter change. Those are a lot harder. And that's when you see people thinking, my life is falling apart. Then you have a tier change, and that's when all three of those parameters change. Let's take it from the subtle tier to the meta-aware tier. You've got subtle, for the 4.5, then, their frame is subtle, their frame is collective, and then their frame is they interpenetrate. They're interpenetrating with these projections. They understand that what's in me is in you. So that's an interpenetrative thing, a oneness experience that they have in the relative. But when they get into the 5.0, they're now in the meta-aware tier. They're now in in an individual stage rather than a collective stage. And they're now in a receptive stage rather than an interpenetrative stage. All three of them, that's when things really change. So a lot of people think that every transformation is the same. We have three different kinds of transformations, and some of them are really hard. Others are not so hard. And one of the things that helps the most is if you can recognize after a while that you're in a confused state, you recognize you're in a transformation, and then trying to look at what kind of a transformation am I in? This is where it helps to, if you don't know the stage of development that you're coming out of or into, it helps to take an inventory and talk with a developmentalist about that because they can help you a lot. And there's a specific confusion that comes up at each one of those kinds of changes. And if you know what the confusion is, you get a big, aha, that's why I'm feeling so messed up, you know? And when they get through that confusion, the transformation is over and they start blossoming into that next stage. So that's what understanding the structural aspect versus the stereotypical aspects are in each stage.
One thing I would add is I remember I was in a dark night of the soul, you could call it. And my spiritual teacher was like, can you just like accept that you're in a process right now? And that the more I just like was just like, you know what? This is just what my life is like right now. I can't do a lot of the things I used to be able to do. My days are different. Everything's different. A lot of things don't fit. Man, that it's like I went from feeling like I was in quicksand to things starting to just start to work again.
It's one of the most beautiful gifts you can give somebody that's in a transformation to say, guess what? You're changing. This is normal. And you're going through something that will help you have bigger insights and see things in even a better way than you do now. Enjoy it. A transformation can actually be enjoyable. And if other people, like when you go from into the meta-aware tier, that's a really big shift. And people have certain kinds of things that are happening to them, and their family and friends notice it. And sometimes they will get worried about you and say, oh, well, what's wrong with this person? I wonder if they've got some psychological thing going on. If you yourself recognize you're in that transformation, it's so easy to say, nope, it's not. I know what's going on with myself and it's going to go away pretty soon. I'm just in a transformation. So put up with me for now. I'll be better a little later. People will accept that and it doesn't scare them to death that you're, going off the rails or something. So knowing what's going on in this transformation for yourself so you can help the people around you is really helpful.
Is there some notion of specific archetypes like at these inflection points where it's like, okay, you're moving from subtle to meta, you can expect to experience X, Y, Z, and here's exactly how you move through X, Y, and Z. Is that part of the work in working with a developmentalist or stages specifically?
Well, there's certain the word archetypes has a lot of different meanings. We all have parts inside of ourselves, and some people put archetypal kinds of labels on those parts. For instance, okay, I've got a firefighter inside of myself. It puts out all the fires. I have a protector inside of myself, and it protects me from all of these things that I'm not aware of. I have uh, a loving part of myself that keeps me connected with my family. So you have all of these parts inside of yourself that have been constructed through the years to take care of yourself. You can't see that until you get to the green 4.0 level, which is often a very misunderstood level. It's one of the most gorgeous levels that anybody can ever go through, but it can be very tiresome for people that are around somebody in that particular developmental level. But that these parts come up, you put a label on them and they kind of become like an archetype. Everybody goes through these archetypes, you know. Well, when people start recognizing their parts and they don't put somebody else's label on it, they just commune with their part until they can name them themselves, because maybe the part that they're communing with isn't a protector. It has some other nuance that and then maybe you just want to name it Joe because it's unique, you know, rather than to give it a bounded name. So so it stops being an archetype then. Then there are larger archetypes that happen through time. Jungian archetypes, I think, tend to be a little bit more like that. Um, and they are you know, um, uh, they come, you know, like from history, in these different cycles in history that we might be working with, and they cycle and repeat. So that's where time comes up, and the developmental levels of time. So at first, babies get time just because it's time to go to bed and it's time to get up. It's light and dark, and that cycles day after day after day. And they pretty soon they understand this cycle. Then after 3 or 4 or 5 years, they realize, oh, it's springtime. The flowers are growing. Oh, it's summertime. I get to go swimming. It's fall. The leaves are falling. It's winter. It's snowing outside. They don't understand that for 3 or 4 or 5 years because they've only been through it once. But once they get that cycle and they understand time. So their relationship with that time is often, it's summer, it's fall, it's winter, it's spring, it's summer, it's fall, it's winter, it's spring. And they back off and they know what's going to happen because of the cycle. The cycles have already happened. They're continuing on to happen. And so what they see then is the past is my future. So they don't see an imagined future that they have never seen before. The past is my future because how do I know? Because I know that every spring this happens, and you know, I know that, my father was a farmer, my grandfather was a farmer, and I'm going to be a farmer. These kinds of things, because they look at the past and the past becomes their future. When we get to the subtle tier, however, we look at time a different way because suddenly we can see things in the future that haven't been in the cycles. There are things that we can make up in our own mind that we maybe haven't seen in the past, or things that have not cycled through my past or my family's past. And so they start setting a goal, and a goal is a linear thing. So we start getting linear time in the subtle tier. So, and a step by step by step. And this is, for the most part, people work with linear time in the next 4 stages in the subtle tier. Then when we get to the meta-aware tier, we start looking at cycles in all of history, and we can see, we've had all kinds of cycles that keep coming back, and keep coming back, keep coming back. And this can be confusing because, for instance, we have climate change now, and we're making the assumption that climate change is something that we created. But some people who are poking into the meta-aware tier sometimes, and even earlier, they'll say, we've had these cycles forever. I mean, this used to be, um, Montana used to be covered with a glacier. And then it receded, and then it came back again. And then, you know, climates change. Maybe that's what we're in. So you see, there's these different ways of seeing the cycles when you look at them through history. And a lot of people are looking at them through history now. The thing is that in our work, we can see that at the 5.5 stage, people start writing about recursion. They start, and they don't do that before that stage. So we know that people, by the time they get to that stage, they're going to start seeing recursiveness again, cycles, only they're much, much larger.
I was just going
Yeah,
to ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind,
okay.
on there,
No.
you know, in the
Yeah.
meta-aware, as the meta-aware stages advance, like how does the perception of what is the relationship with time, how does that evolve? You mentioned cycles. What happened? Is there there's
Yeah.
things beyond that?
Yes, because at some point, and this happens again at 5.5, they start thinking about these cycles that happen through time and through their lives. And all of a sudden they realize, but they're thinking about those cycles right now. And then they start thinking about, well, what am I going to do with all this information that I've gathered? And then they realize they're thinking about that right now. They have never lived the cycles 1,000, 2,000 years ago. They just know about them and they're thinking about them right now. They haven't lived the future experiences that they're going to have, but they're thinking about them right now. Everything seems to be right now. And there isn't a real past and a real future. Everything is right now. And actually, when you get to it, this right now is awful big because all of those information, all that information is coming up in this right now moment. And actually, there isn't even a moment because there's no beginning and no end to this right nowness that everything is coming up into in my mind. Oh, I become aware and experiencing timelessness. And this is part of the spiritual path. You have to have these spiritual realizations in order to get into these later developmental stages at the meta-aware tier. So we score for states because we know which state is required in order for a stage to actually manifest in the meta-aware tier. You have states all the way along, but people don't see them or understand them or recognize them unless they are taking a spiritual path of some kind, and they can have timelessness in the concrete tier, actually. But actually, they experience timelessness all the way up to about the age of 7 or 8. That's when they start understanding time. They're just spontaneously in everything. They don't see a beginning and an end very much. They're just in it now. They
So
just don't recognize it. That's all.
is it fair to say that really the meta-aware tier is pretty unaccessible if you don't take up some sort of spiritual path?
Well, there have been a few people that I know that they have just had a proclivity for focusing and concentrating on any kind of state that comes up through time. There's not very many of them. They can actually reach these states without a lot of training, but the few people that I know that have done that have spent their whole life focusing and building these necessary capacities so that they can move into these later states. So I wouldn't say they have to have a spiritual path. The thing is about taking a well-developed spiritual path from a leader that, I mean, um, they seem to not have any, they seem to have taken care of most of their dark shadows. They seem to be fundamentally wise, uh, and and they have already been through these stages, so they can recognize them in you. These spiritual states, they can recognize them in you when you have them, when you can have them and not know what they are, and that is really helpful. And so, most of us, including me, I need help. And it's really easy to fall off the wrong end, off to the edges of any spiritual path. If you don't have somebody there to say, whoops, you went a little too far that way. You need to pull back into the center. Whoops, you went a little too far over here. When you do it yourself, it's easy to fall into those, and self-correcting it can sometimes be a little more difficult. But I know a couple of people who've done very well all by themselves. As far as I know, I mean, I'm not a spiritual teacher, but from what I can tell, developmentally, they've managed to get pretty late and never have had a spiritual teacher. I recommend spiritual teachers, actually.
Me too.
Good one.
Me too. Biggest unlock in my growth journey for sure. Having,
Yeah.
I guess, I don't know if I found the teacher or she found me, but connecting with one.
It makes a difference. Yes.
One thing there was a period of time in my journey where I actually was like obsessed with these models. I think actually the first person I came across that had some unified model of consciousness was David Hawkins.
Oh, yes.
And then that got me reading Ken Wilber, and I was like, wow, I love these models. And then there was a point where I was like, I'm actually pretty good on the models. Like, I kind of have to work with just like what's arising in the present moment, cool that these things exist. Is that part of like these developmental models, is like you become really interested in understanding this, and then it starts to become maybe perhaps less interesting at a certain point?
Well, yes, I think a lot of people become very, very interested in typologies, um, developmental models like Ken's, which is more of a structural model, um, particularly at the 4.5 teal stage. I mean, you recognize that development happens. You recognize that there are these fundamental aspects, and you want to know more about it. And a good way to understand that is to see the boundaries that they have. Then when you get into the meta-aware tier, the point of stages don't really care that much about models. What they want to do is experience. They need the experience in order to have a mature perspective. So let's take the 4.0 green level that is in a lot of stages models. That's a 0.0 stage, and they don't care. Usually, development is not something that is all that. And sometimes typologies work there, but they want experience. They wanted to experience the depth of reciprocity. In other words, they want to go beyond transactionalism. They want to know, how can I be with you in a way that I can learn more about myself? Suddenly I realize, oh my gosh, this person can see things in me I can't see in myself. And I do not like that. But I also don't want to be running around in the world knowing that everybody's seeing things about me that I don't know. So I better listen to this person. You learn so much about yourself. They do the same thing. And this brings a reciprocity that gets deeper and deeper and deeper. This is really important. However, when you get into the 4.5 level, you already have tons of experience in that area, and you want to do something with it. It's it's a mature fourth person perspective. So you get at the 0.5 stages, you get a witness. You can reflect on things. You can stand back and you can look at the structure of how that reciprocity goes. You can see the structure of the social construction of reality. You can see the structure of complex adaptive systems. Then you can know how you zero in and take care of a pain point and zero back out. And these models really help you do that because you can put them in a frame. Then next stage is another horizontal stage. You have development, you have these models, but you want to be in an experience again. So you background that and you foreground the experience of the 5.0, which is actually beginning to experience awareness that is beyond the ordinary mind, transpersonal awareness. That's what your focus is on. It's not that you don't believe in models or that you don't believe or you don't, you just, that's not where your focus is. Then when you come to the next stage, some of these models can be helpful again, but that's when you start looking at, okay, maybe these models don't really work for me. Maybe I can develop my own model. And you may not tell anybody about that model, but it may be something interior where you bring together several paradigms like psychology and education and maybe somatics or visualizations or very different ways of working, maybe with something like ecology, you know. Uh, and so you use your own models. But even as you do that, you start moving into boundlessness and timelessness in that stage. And you're back in a horizontal stage again where you don't care about models that much anymore. So you see, it's God's rocking chair kind of.
That's really cool. What are your personal beliefs on like what determines someone's experience in a lifetime, of like where they go, how fast they go on the path, how fast they move through this continuum. um yeah, I'm curious if that's something that Stages has a perspective on or you have a personal perspective on.
I guess, if you look at one lifetime, um, there are some mysteries that there are some things you cannot measure. And I would be the first to say that the stages model does not measure lots of things. Um, we can get to some of the aspects of development, but um, sometimes people have terrible traumas when they're growing up, and those traumas somehow catapult them into later developmental levels because they survived them. They become incredibly resilient. Sometimes people that have those very similar tragedies get frozen and stuck and they can't get out of their dilemmas. We don't sometimes know how or why. Now, some of the great traditions explain this in a different way. Not all of the traditions, but some of them look at past lives and say, well, you know, you're just in the third of many lifetimes, or you're getting close to the end of your path. We don't have any way of understanding that or knowing that. It can be a belief that some people have and a way of explaining why they've struggled so much in their life and why they've moved slower or faster than other people. We don't, I personally don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But um, my sense is that we are living this lifetime, and this lifetime is gorgeous, and that the troubles that we have, oftentimes we can be very grateful for, because without those troubles, we would not have learned. So gratitude starts arising. We may have had a loveless experience in our childhood, and yet we might meet one person that believes in us, a teacher or somebody that believes in us, and we experience love. And the contrast between the lovelessness and the love catapults us into a love that ordinary people with ordinary lives really never really get. Uh, so we have gratitude, we have love, compassion, the same way, um, altruistic joy, wanting, and being so happy, happy, happy when I get it. And then you have a child and you want something, and your child has just gone into adulthood and they get it. You find yourself, it doesn't matter if you don't get it because they got it. It's altruistic joy for somebody else that they get something even that you want and you never did get to have in your life. So you're joyful for everybody. These positive emotions start coming up as a result of some of the struggles that we've had. So we learn to love our struggles. We learn so much from our struggles that when we have struggles, we look for what the learning will be instead of looking for what the tragedies are. This is where goodness begins to grow up with everything that we do. And so I love our lives, even if it's the only one we have. And of course, I have a belief in an essence of some kind that lives beyond that. Some people say when we die, that's it. We don't know.
Well, getting comfortable with not knowing is part of the
Yeah,
experience, I would say.
I think so.
Terri, I think there's probably a lot of people listening who are curious to learn more about stages, maybe want to know what's next for you guys. I know there's been talks of producing a book. I'd
Yes.
love for you to just share more on what's next and where people can go if they want to explore the work further.
Well, you're right. I am trying to get a book written. I've written enough material over my lifetime for quite a number of books, but I am going to try to put the specifics of the what is the actual day to day steps, the feet on the ground steps. All of this material is worth nothing if our conduct doesn't change. That's the ultimate. How are we with the rest of the people around us? And so that's what this book will be about. How might these developmental understandings be? And it's not done yet, and I'm starting to work on it, and I hope it gets finished, and I think it will. But other than that, we have some classes that might be interesting to people. Sometimes you can sit right next to somebody and not know the developmental level they're at, even though you studied the developmental levels. It's really helpful that you can get a pretty good idea where somebody is at developmentally because it helps you bring compassion to wherever they are because every stage needs some compassion and you need it too. We all do. So we have a course called Recognizing Developmental Stages that will help people learn to recognize them. We just finished that course, but we'll have another one next year. The biggest class we have right now is one called The Mind's Eye. And that is if you want to know a lot about your own development in a journey with a bunch of other people, you can take this class. So you start with your own autobiography. You look at how are you socially constructed? How has that moved through the years? And you look at every stage, every transformation, all the way up through the latest stage, because a lot of people have states that are at the latest stage, but they just don't have the relative aspect of that. We do it with a group of people. So you're comparing and looking at the generational differences of, for instance, we have let's say we're taking a third person perspective and we have somebody that's 25 years old that is doing it in the world today. And then we have somebody 84 that's doing it and they went through that stage many years ago. What's the difference between 3.5 in the world we live in today and 3.5 in a world that had no electricity, no running water, no iPads, no telephone, and yet the 3.5 still can come up there. So that that is very interesting. It takes a year to do, but those are some of the things that we try and focus on in our work.
Well, it sounds like some great opportunities for deepening understanding, and that book also sounds profoundly useful. So I wish you the best of success in creating that. And for everyone listening, we'll make sure to link out all of those resources. The website is stagesinternational.com.
Yes, yes.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Terri. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Scott. I enjoyed it.